this week's show, we are discussing foreign intervention and the refugee crisis with our guest Joey King from Veterans for Peace. Veterans for Peace is in the forefront of exposing the true cost of war since 1985, and they have about 100 active U.S. chapters plus chapters in the U.K., Ireland, Mexico, Japan, and Vietnam. The chapter in Nashville was formed in 2003. Joey King has been an ESL teacher in Nashville for almost 15 years and teaches English to refugees for the last 5 years. He served in several military roles and graduated from prestigious military schools. Mr. King, can you tell us a little bit about your military experience and what led you to resign and become part of Veterans for Peace?
Sure. I spent 4 years in college ROTC at Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville in the 80s, and then got into the infantry. I was an infantry officer, and went to Ranger School, Airborne School, all that kind of stuff, and I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne and the paratrooper unit over in Vicenza, Italy. And so, fortunately, I was in my service time was during peacetime, so I didn't have any combat experience. And then, soon after I got out, I just started investigating more and more and more, and finding out, that a lot of the things I was told was not really true, and became a member of Veterans for Peace, in 2003, and been preaching the message of peace for a lot longer than that, but been doing it through Veterans for Peace for a while.
So how did you get involved with working with refugees?
That's an interesting story. I ended up working at a sales job, and I was in Chattanooga. At the time, I'd taken a company transfer, and was working for a company and just waiting on a customer in a lobby, and was thumbing through a magazine that was sitting there, and it said in the back of the magazine had an ad for English as a second language teacher. So it said you can travel the world and teach English, and that kind of stuck in my mind. So when I moved back to Nashville in 2000, I decided to pursue that. So I found there's a state agency called Tennessee Foreign Language Agency that it was just getting kick-started basically to do teacher training. So I went through their teacher training course, and I've been teaching ever since. Haven't taught overseas, but I've been teaching in Nashville for about 15 years.
And what kind of refugees are you helping?
At the moment, my refugees are from Burma and from Bhutan.
How is the refugee process like, and how many people do they usually bring to the Tennessee area? I know that the different states have different rules about that.
Yeah, it's a quota system basically that we take in Tennessee. I don't exactly know the numbers. The organization I work for has the contract with the state to teach the refugees here in Nashville. So it is kind of a long process. Some of my students have been in refugee camps for 20 years. I've had students who are actually born in the refugee camps, let's say in Bhutan, who had never set foot in Bhutan, but when you ask them, they'll tell you they're Bhutanese, and they were actually born in Nepal at a refugee camp. So it's a tragic story with a lot of these people. I've had amputees, who have lost an arm or a joint or some kind in combat, or just been part of a torture campaign. So it's they all have pretty horrific stories.
There are many things I want to discuss, but let's start from this idea of the U.S. being involved in other people's conflicts, either both in a positive way and a negative way. I had a friend who would say, well, when we go and liberate people, we end up the bad guys because we stir up the pot over there. When we don't get involved, we are the bad guys because we're letting people die. And then when we're involved in a limited way, kind of like with Libya, then we're still the bad guys because we didn't let the dictator stick around, and now the terrorists took over, or we let the dictator stick around, and then we're bad because we're supporting the dictator. So can the U.S. ever figure out a way to work with their partners around the world where military can be used as a way to actually help? Or is it always bad and is always opportunistic and is always trying to destabilize different?
I think it's probably more the latter. From a constitutional standpoint, we really shouldn't be outside the U.S. unless there's some kind of imminent threat, which really hasn't existed, arguably since World War II. But we end up creating. I guess there's a doctrine of unintended consequences, and we end up creating a lot more problems than we solve.
They always point to World War II, even though the U.S. didn't get involved all the way to the end. That was a time where the U.S. got involved and they actually helped. People who have a positive view of military intervention, they'll always use that as an example. And then everything else that has happened since then, well, it was mistakes or it was just poor administration of the resources. Deep inside, we want to help people like we did in World War II.
Well, there's lots of ways to help. I mean, Mexico and Ireland have non-interventionist policies, and, they seem to be doing okay, and they help a lot of people. It's kind of interesting when you talk to Latin Americans. They just really don't have this sense of World War II, and World War I that we do, that were good wars, quote unquote. They just really don't see it that way because Latin America has always pursued a non-interventionist policy for the most part, and I think that's probably the better way to go on a whole.
Okay, so speaking of the current events, just yesterday Tom Hartman blamed foreign intervention for the rise of ISIS and the attacks in Brussels. Is that a fair thing to do?
Sure. You can trace a direct line from our intervention in Afghanistan in the late 70s and early 80s straight to the attack yesterday. It's a direct line. There's no denying that. That created the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which obviously Osama bin Laden was a part of. Then we went into the Iraq War, the first Iraq War in the early 90s, and that alienated a lot of people. Like again, Osama bin Laden being one of them, because we had what they viewed as infidels in Saudi Arabia and places like that. So you can draw a direct line from 1979, our intervention in Afghanistan, to what happened yesterday. Absolutely.
So radical nationalist Arab groups have nothing to do with it, and jihadist groups have nothing to do with it. It's just us poking at them and them coming after us, because it seems kind of like victim blaming if that's the only way that you can look at the situation.
Well, it is a chicken or egg situation. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? If you want to go back to Richard the Lionheart killing 3,500 Muslim prisoners that, probably no one in the United States knows about, but every Muslim knows about, that they would say that's the start of it, and that goes back to the First Crusade. Where do you want to draw that line? Martin Luther King said that violence only begets more violence. Well, he's getting that straight out of the Bible, and Gandhi said, an eye for an eye, lead the whole world blind. So it really depends on where you want to draw the line. Do you want to draw the line with Richard the Lionheart, or do you want to draw the line at our interventionism into Afghanistan, or do you want to draw the line in September 11th, or do you want to draw the line yesterday? It just depends on where you want to draw the line.
Okay. In the presidential debates, there has been a push for a stronger military. Both Kasich and Trump seem to want to start wars with everyone. How does it make you feel when you hear politicians who have never served in the military speak in this way?
Term we have for it called chicken hawks. They're awfully good about sending someone else's son or daughter off to fight, but they didn't want to do it themselves. Trump had 5 deferments in Vietnam, yet he always felt like a soldier. Well, very, very, very few people had 5 deferments, and you normally had to have political connections. And the only 2 people I'm aware of that had 5 are people like Dick Cheney, who had 5 deferments, and Donald Trump, who had 5 deferments. Just very, very, very few people got that. They were politically well-connected people. But, Ted Cruz and, just going down the line. They're always anxious to send someone else's children off to war. And that's, there's a good quote by George Orwell, that went something like, for all the screaming of the war hawks, you notice they're always willing to send someone else's children into war. and that's a perfect case of this. What we don't realize in this country is that the United States spends more than any other country by far. Half of the world's military dollars, year in and year out, been following this data for 15 years, but half of the military dollars spent in the world are spent with the United States. We have 5% of the world's population. We have about 25% of the world's wealth. Yet, we spend half of, or all the military dollars are spent on by the United States. So we are already spending way more than anybody else, and we're spending way more than can be justified by our percentage of the wealth or by our world population. We should be spending about 5% of the world's dollars should be spent with the United States on the military, yet we're spending about half. And you ask Americans how much, if you counted up all the world's military dollars, how much is spent in the United States. I've done this as a thought experiment. You'll get about 10%. Most people say maybe 5%. They have no idea that we spend half of the world. So, put another way, we spend more than the rest of the world combined. It varies year by year, but it hovers right around that figure.
Why is that? Why do we spend so much money? Is it something that was set up after World War II to be able to say that we're the strongest country, or is it like they say that it's the people that make the weapons that are controlling where the money goes, and they are all friends with the politicians, and they're selling them more and more?
Every congressional district has some kind of military contract in it, and the Pentagon is very smart about that. And it does have to do with World War II, but if you think about it, Morris Berman, who's a philosopher, got so fed up with the U.S. he lives in Mexico now, said something pretty interesting. And basically it said that American history, dating to 1607, when the Virginia colony was founded, has always been defined as the other. First it was Indians being the other, and then 1619 it was black people being the other, and then later it was the French and the Spanish and the Mexicans, and then, 100 years ago it started being the communists. And you can pretty much define American history from 1607 till today as being obsessed with the other, and that has a lot of profound consequences. One is the military spending. We had plenty of military spending before World War II. Plenty of times in our history. Slavery was ended in every country in the New World without a war, except in the United States and in Haiti, which had a slave revolt. And it's this whole obsession with the other. What is the other? Who is the other? And let's protect ourselves from the other. And it's kind of an interesting thing. A good friend of mine was at the VA hospital. He'd cut his hand. He just went to the emergency room to get a few stitches in it about 5 years ago. He was talking to a young man beside him who had just returned from Afghanistan. This young man said, I'm guarding the perimeter. Well, Afghanistan is now the perimeter of the United States. Well, the same thing can be said when Tennessee was added to the Union in 1796. Well, that was to guard the perimeter of Virginia and North Carolina. And then later on we added Arkansas. Why? Because we were getting Indian attacks from, Tennessee was getting too many Indian attacks. So we had to guard the perimeter, and then it just went right across to California. And in the 1898, we have to acquire Hawaii and Guam and Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain as part of the perimeter. And now the world is the perimeter. And it's this obsession with the other, and you can date it to 1607, or you can date it to after World War II, whichever you choose. It's still part of the American psyche.
So people have compared Donald Trump with Benito Mussolini. I see him more like Richard Nixon, attacking protesters, sending more troops just out of selfish pride, not a quitter. They never talk about the toll that it takes on the soldiers, their families, and the people from other countries. Do you see that happening too? That, they just start wars to prove that America is tough, and then they don't really care about the consequences? The
soldier after the war is always the forgotten one. There's an old Bill Monroe song from the 20s called I'm Just a Poor Old Soldier. The Monroe brothers did it back in the late 20s, and they were lamenting about the plight of the World War I soldier who came back. If you ever heard of the Bonus March during the Great Depression, where World War I soldiers from all over came to Washington in the early 30s, and General MacArthur, who was a one-star general at the time, put down this rebellion by the soldiers. It's always been that way, and it's like we were talking about earlier. They're always happy to send someone else's kid to be killed or maimed or have post-traumatic stress disorder. They're always very anxious to do that. And I think Trumpism, whether Trump is elected or not, will not die in November. Trumpism will go on, and I'm afraid that if Trump is defeated, defeated, that his followers will feel like they have no other choice other than violence to resort to. And we're going to have similar to 1968 type violence, in the wake of the Vietnam War and everything that was going on in the Democratic Party. I think we're going to see something like that. I hope I'm wrong. I'm afraid we're going to see something like that. We're already starting to see signs of it, at Trump rallies where people are getting punched out and Trump is egging them on to kick that guy out or put him in the hospital or something like that. And it's setting a really bad tone that I'm afraid it's been there, but it's been muted. And I think now it's sort of coming to the forefront as quite frankly, white people are on the last verge of being a minority. And this is sort of what happens when you have had a majoritarian rule by one group and it's sort of slipping away. And unfortunately, going to see some social unrest as a result, I'm afraid.
Everybody's talking about people are angry and this and that. I want to know, why are they angry? I know that we had economic problems in 2008. I know that people might not have the best jobs or the best medical insurance, but it's not like we are in a third world country where people are starving and struggling to survive. People are very comfortable. Are they being incited to be angry about stuff that doesn't really affect them? Where is all this hatred coming from? Is it just paranoia? Or
Dr. Noam Chomsky may have the best view on this. I think it's an intentional step-by-step process. It started right around World War I when the American public reelected Woodrow Wilson on a ticket that he would not send our boys to fight a European war in 1916. And all of a sudden, 6 weeks later, the opinion changed. Well, the opinion changed because of some very brilliant people who were marketers who were hired by Wilson to change the minds of the American people. And it only took 6 weeks to where they elected someone who was not going to get us into war, to where war fever was going on. And it's kind of a process. And to be frank, the fascists in Europe studied the processes that we used in World War I on how to do this. And part of that is alienation, to make people feel atomized, atomized, where they're just individual and they're not connected to anyone. The internet has further, fueled that. Although we're connected in one way on the internet, you can chat with anybody, in Brazil or wherever you want to. In other ways, we don't even know our neighbor across the street, and it makes us feel more like no one cares or no one's connected. And I think that's a really, really big part of it with what's going on. Just this feeling of not being connected. And I agree people have the right to be angry. I just think that, a lot of people are angry. They don't understand. They've been so confused. They don't understand what they should be angry about. I mean, we don't really have a good healthcare system like they have in Europe, for example. We have less social mobility than you have in Europe. Although that's the reason we fought a revolution, so it's what they will tell you on the other side. It's just not bearing out to be true here. You if you're born into a class, you stay in that class. And people understand that there's something wrong, but they just haven't taken the time to get deep into it. Americans are notorious for a short attention span. You can't keep if it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, you can say it in 25 seconds. It just gets lost on a lot of people. And that's one reason why I'm glad we have places like Radio Free Nashville, where people want to think about things can think them through a little more and talk about them. And I think that's a lot of why people are upset. People like Bernie Sanders are kind of tapping in on that. And if you want to think of Bernie Sanders as kind of the next iteration of the Occupy movement we had a few years ago, and Donald Trump as being the next iteration of the Tea Party that we had a few years ago, I think that's a good way to look at it. And the same thing that had people upset, when the market crashed in 2008, really haven't been resolved because the people at the bottom do not have any more. The corporations are getting rich, but the people are not.
So let's talk about scapegoating. I know that this has happened in the past with immigrants in the U.S. They used to blame the Irish and the Italians, and now they blame Mexican immigrants. But this whole idea of blaming Arabs or Muslims for what a small group of people do, the one thing that I see that can be compelling to the public, when you bring refugees or immigrants to a country, unless you do a very thorough background, and how do you know who's going to do something? This idea of we'll just keep all of them out seems an easy way to address the issue. Is part of the paranoia to start saying, well, let's not even deal with them?
It's part of the propaganda that is arising around this issue. People are screened. You don't just one day walk up and say, I am a refugee. The UN screens you and determines if you are a refugee or not. I mean, we don't have any refugees from Latin America anymore. I mean, we got plenty of problems in Latin America, especially in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and we've got a lot of people, trying to get to the U.S. because of the, mainly drug war violence in those countries, but they're not refugees. Refugees are a very, very, very specific designation. When I first started fooling with refugees a few years ago, there were like 40 million of them. Now, 5 years later, we have 61 million. That has increased. Last year, I'm talking 2014, was the first year that the number of refugees went over 50 million since World War II, basically since the UN created the refugee documentation system that we have today. That increased to 11 million in 1 year. Now, just to give you an idea, the U.S. was taking, when I first started, half of the world's refugees. Only 1% of the refugees get resettled. That's another big misconception. When you ask people, the average person, how many refugees get resettled, they'll tell you 90, 95%. The true fact of that is it's about 1%. And when I first started 5 years ago, we were taking in half of the world's refugees. The other half went to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the European Union. But the problem is we were only taking in about, I forget how many, in the hundreds of thousands, and there were millions coming into the refugee system every year. So there were way more coming into the refugee system of the UN than were being resettled. I'm talking about permanently resettled. I'm not talking about like the Syrians who are, in Turkey at the moment. That's not a permanent. That's a temporary resettlement. That's not a permanent resettlement. I'm talking about people who are permanently resettled. Only about 1% get permanently resettled. Out of all those 60 million, you can figure that about 1% each year are going to get resettled. So it's a huge problem. And to think these people are not screened by UN, people who are trained at the UN, it's just insanity. It's just a complete lack of knowledge of what's going on in the refugee system.
This thing about blaming the U.S. for the refugee crisis, I know that in some cases like Iraq and the U.S. was at fault for creating a refugee crisis from people in that country. But in Syria, other than supporting the dictator, if they've done it, willingly or unwillingly, a lot of people say, well, it's not our problem for us to send troops or to take in refugees. Do you consider this like a selfish thing, or is there a point to that where people say, we can't really take all the world's problems onto our country?
Well, I think you're not really looking at it deep enough. I mean, the problems that we have in the Middle East and Africa are a direct result of how the lines were drawn on the borders in World War I. So we're talking about in 1919 at the Treaty of Paris, and I highly recommend you read a book called Paris 1919. It's about 700 pages, some of the most tedious reading you'll ever do, I promise you. But if you'll read it, it explains a lot about how those problems from that treaty created what we have today. So to say that we did not create the Syrian refugee crisis is to not look at 100 years of history. Basically, the European powers colonized from 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World and colonized and colonized and colonized till there was no place left to colonize. And World War I was sort of that first explosion of the breakup of the colonial system. The result of World War I was the Treaty of Paris, which directly led to World War II. But it also led to a lot of problems that we have still today. For example, if you look at Syria, and you look at Iraq, and you look at Iran, and you look Turkey, you have the Kurdish people, the second largest ethnic population without a country, because the British divided them into four different countries. Well, guess what? A lot of the problems that we've had since, the early 90s in these places are a direct result of the Kurdish issue. or the Pashtuns. The Pashtuns, another group that made the British mad, were divided between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Well, guess what? A lot of the problems we're having with the Taliban and whatnot are the result of where the British drew the line in 1919. So to say that we are not responsible for Syria or for the problem with the Pashtuns and the Taliban is just to throw away 100 years worth of history. You just can't look at it that narrowly, and you have to look at the whole picture. And if you want to start with 1919, where the British drew those horrible borders and created a civil war in Sudan that has only recently led to the split of the country, but that civil war lasted for 40 years. Well, it's because of the way they drew the line, and now we have North Sudan and South Sudan, or the way they drew the line in Yugoslavia, which created horrible war in Europe in the early 90s, that are now the 7 countries that they were before World War I. And you can go on and on with how badly that treaty still is affecting us today. So, and America was part of that treaty that we forced on Germany and the Ottoman Empire.
But at what point are the leaders of those countries responsible? I know that the U.S. either supports or not supports different leaders, but I'm from Latin America, and when I hear people say, well, the reason that Mexico is messed up is because of the U.S., I'll be the first one to say, no, the U.S. has done bad deals and stuff like that, but the Mexican leaders are the ones that are exploiting the population and then working things out with the Americans. So what about the role of the poor leadership in those countries?
Sure, and lots of times it's leaders that we prop up. If you look at the Middle East, for example, we propped up Saddam Hussein. We're propping up the Saudis. We propped up the Afghan government before. We did a coup in 1953 in Iran. We installed the Shah that caused the 1979 revolution. And Latin America, the second CIA coup ever was in the first one was in Iran, the second one was in Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. A lot of these. Sure, there are a lot of leaders that are horrible in these countries, but a lot of times, if you look at it, the U.S. or the West in general has propped up these leaders or installed them or instigated a coup, which is a war crime, to prop them up. Sure, there's some bad leaders, no question about that, and oppressive and ruthless, but when you look at it, a lot of times the person behind the curtain that's pulling the strings is often the United States or one of the United States allies, former colonial powers from days gone by.
I just interviewed a couple from Turkey, and I try to make distinctions between Western culture and Middle Eastern culture, and it wasn't working with them. They weren't seeing it as Western and Eastern. They were seeing it as modern and traditional. So when they would talk about the negative effects of religious leaders taking over or politicians using religion for their purposes, it was always this thing about, well, there's people who are trying to be modern, there's people who are trying to be conservative, traditional, stuff like that.
I think you got two things going on in Turkey. For one, it's where Europe meets Asia. It's where the Christian world meets the Muslim world. It's right at that border. 10% of Turkey around Istanbul is part of Europe, and the rest of Turkey is not. And I've been to Turkey. My last deployment when I was in the Army was to Turkey on the old Soviet Union border, which I guess now would be on the country of Georgia border. So Turkey is that flux there. So I think that's part of what you were trying to get at with them. But the other part of it, too, and not many people subscribe to this theory, but I do, Islam is going through a reformation. It's the only religion that has never gone through a reformation. I mean, you look at Christianity, you look at Judaism, you look at Buddhism, you look at Hinduism, they've all gone through reformations. The one that hasn't is Islam. And I think as part of that, what they were saying in that is the old versus new, I think is really, we're going to look back at it 100 years from now and say, that was during the Islamic Reformation. And we never know how reformations are going to turn out. We often don't know that it's going on when it's going on. And we don't know if it's going to be conservative. They're bloody. They can last hundreds of years. Look at the Protestant Reformation in Christianity, for example, how bad that was. I mean, we killed Indians all across this country as part of the Protestant Reformation. That was an outgrowth of it. And so these reformations can be nasty things, and I think that's part of what we're going through. So I think there was two parts there with that Turkish couple you was talking about. The part where Europe meets Asia, and the part where they were calling it old versus new. I would say it's a reformation that just hasn't been acknowledged. Now, I would say this reformation began in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution occurred. That would be my theory on it. But again, you don't know about a reformation as it's going on, and it's going on now and go on probably the rest of my life, and I'm 54.
See, but when people say that the Muslim world has issues with the U.S., maybe it's not that they only have issues with the U.S. They have issues. Some of them have issues with becoming too modern too quick, or they were already modern like Turkey and they decided to bounce back to a more traditional or even extremist position.
Absolutely, yes. It's both. It's absolutely both. And I would say that's part of this reformation that's going on within the Islamic world. And how it's going to turn out, it's impossible to tell.
So they were talking about Brussels, and they're saying that the North African community has been marginalized, and it's easy for ISIS or other groups to tap into that disenfranchisement of the people. But then you have other cases like Al-Qaeda where they were all educated, well-fed, they were Lebanese or Saudi, and they were doing okay. So they shift the blame. So it goes from the U.S. is doing bad stuff over there and it's upsetting them, or they live in Europe and they're being mistreated. And there's always these, the blame going around. And to me, it's like, when are they going to talk about why extremism is the problem?
Exactly. And again, I think it's actually both dynamics going on. I don't think it's either or. I think there's a reformation going on within Islam, and I think it's the West meddling in it as well. I think it's both.
So since Americans don't understand this or have limited knowledge of that, then when it comes down to refugees, they're making these blanket statements like, well, they're all from that group, so we can't trust them.
Sure. And I mean, let's just face it, refugees don't come from stable countries. They don't want to be here. That's what upset me so much when Ben Carson went over and talked with some Syrian refugees. Well, they would rather be in Syria. Every student I've ever had has told me that. They'd rather be in their home country. But there is no home anymore. I remember listening to NPR about a year ago, and this woman said about Syria, said, they should stay home and fight for their country. Well, there is no country to fight for. There's about 5 different factions fighting, if not more. And, it's a war of all against all. Who are they going to fight for? Refugees would rather stay in their country. They don't want to. They don't want to be uprooted and leave their family and their homes and their parents or children or whatever, and uncles and aunts. They would rather be in their country. That's pretty universal, and I've had refugees from many, many countries, and that's one universal thing. They don't want to be here. They're thankful to be here. They're thankful, we don't have war, and our police departments are relatively uncorrupt as compared to their home countries. But they certainly would rather be at home if possible.
Tell me about this SJR 467 rule that they're passing, and the ACLU calls it a fear-based discriminatory measure. They would turn our backs on families fleeing violence and terror. So what are they trying to do here in Tennessee against refugees?
Yeah, it's just, we need to be welcoming. These people, I can't tell you how many of my students work at, let's say a meat packing plant. I won't name a name, but let's just say that I have lots of students that work in the meat packing industry. I've had students there for 10, 15 years, and they're working in a basically 8-hour shift. if not overtime. They're working in a 38-degree room. They're gutting chickens or something along those lines, and they'll work there for 10 years, 15 years. I mean, how many I grew up in a small town about 2 hours east of here with a meat packing plant. And they cycled through all the locals up there pretty quickly and ended up getting immigrant labor in because you couldn't find too many people that's going to work in those conditions. It's not a fun place to work. But to say these people don't contribute, gosh, our hotels are filled with immigrants who are working, as maids or as servers or as cooks, jobs that don't require a lot of English skills are often filled by immigrants who are willing to do the job that Americans just won't do.
What is what they're trying to pass in the state government here in Tennessee?
It's not showing. I would say it's very unchristian. It's just not opening your doors to people that need to have their doors opened. Imagine languishing in a refugee camp for one generation or two, and you're stuck there, and you can't really get a job, and you're dependent on the UN to feed you and give you clothes, and maybe one bathroom for several people, maybe 24 people. These people need help, and we can help them, and we need to help them. I think that's what the Bible says.
So the state of Tennessee is denying the entrance of more refugees, or are they oppressing the ones that are already here?
They're trying to with that law. It's not passed yet, and it's not by any means a clear shot that it's even constitutional what they're trying to do.
Tell us about your organization. What kind of response do you get when you try to reach out to veterans, try to protest the School of the Americas or things like that? Do you get...
Yeah, we do a lot of things. Since you started with School of Americas, I'll mention that. That organization was formed about 25 years ago, and actually 3 of our members were in the original 6 that were part of the first protest all those many years ago. And we've had plenty of people that go to Columbus, Georgia every year for that. It's actually moving this year. It's going to be over the Columbus Day weekend in October in Nogales, Arizona. Is where it's going to be this year. So it's actually moving from Columbus, and that they're kind of a sister organization of ours. The founder is Father Roy Bourgeois, and he is also a member of Veterans for Peace. And that website is www.soaw.org. Our website, where you can find out more about Veterans for Peace, is veteransforpeace.org. And we have a radio show on Radio Free Nashville Thursdays at 1. We started at the beginning of the year, so we're pretty proud of that. We also have a new launch called Veterans Challenge Islamophobia, and that's veteranschallengeislamophobia.org. And we're going to be speaking at a mosque on 12th Avenue Mosque, April 7th at 7 p.m. If anyone would like to come, they're more than welcome to come to that and hear some of the things we've got to say about how we should be building bridges to our Muslim brothers and sisters rather than burning bridges. It's very important. But the original thrust of your question was what do veterans think? And we march every year in the Nashville Veterans Day Parade, probably have for the last 10 years, and we always get a lot of people that are pretty amazed that we exist and are real thankful that we're marching in that parade. Yesterday we do a vigil on the 22nd of every month at 12 o'clock at the Legislative Plaza downtown in Nashville on the state capitol grounds to bring awareness that 22 veterans a day are committing suicide. That's every single day. One active duty and 21 veterans are committing suicide. Most of these people are not combat veterans. They are people who are not been deployed, often National Guard or reservists. And so we're out there every 22nd of the month at 12 o'clock for an hour, just holding up signs just to highlight that 22 people a day die from that. And I was wearing a T-shirt went downtown to do a little research at the National Archives before we did that yesterday, and I was wearing a shirt that said veteransforpeace.org, one of my T-shirts, and this guy behind the counter at the library was, at the archives rather, was just very, very thankful that an organization like that exists. A lot of times I wear my shirt in the airport, and people come up and shake my hand and say, "Wow, I never heard of your group. What are they about?" So, it's mostly positive. Occasionally we'll get something negative, but for the most part, it's positive. And I think that we have, we have a little bit of street cred, so to speak, because we're veterans. We've served in the military. We've sworn to protect the Constitution, and then we're I think have a little more. I also belong to the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. Everybody expects the Buddhists to be against war, but not as many people expect veterans to be against the war. So, when we stand up and say no more war, we're holding a street sign somewhere. If somebody's you kind of have a little more street cred, I think, than somebody who may be a avowed pacifist, who's a Quaker or a Mennonite, for example. So
one of the goals of Veterans for Peace is to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. That's been one of the criticisms of Hillary Clinton, that she's too quick to start a no-fly zone or to fight with another country. Is there a role for the military when the diplomacy doesn't work?
Well, Hillary Clinton was very instrumental in preventing Melvin Zelaya coming back to Honduras in June of 2009 when he was ousted by a coup. Not necessarily prepared to say that the U.S. Pulled the trigger on that coup. I'm still a little bit undecided on that, but did we support the coup afterward? Absolutely. And Hillary Clinton was very, very instrumental in that, even hiring an old Clintonista named Lanny Davis to support the coup as a lobbyist. It's pretty insidious. She is a war hawk, and I just people just don't realize that. She is not a peacemaker. She is a war hawk, and the problems we have in Libya now are a lot of result of some of the things that she did as Secretary of State, and she voted for the war in Iraq in 2003. So it's just, she is just. If you think Hillary's a peacemaker, I would beg to differ.
So, I've asked this to some of my guests before. It's like why Americans are so gullible. And one of the guests didn't like that. He said, people are not gullible. They're just misinformed, or they follow their heart or their gut instinct. Do you think that that's what was going on during 9/11, that people were so quick to support the government no matter what they did?
No, I think they're actually propagandized. Again, I was talking about a few minutes ago, dating back to 1916, when Woodrow Wilson hired those very brilliant marketers to turn our public opinion. Those techniques are still used. Naomi Klein has got a good book on this called The Shock Doctrine that took a lot of the things that the CIA did in the late 40s and how that manifests itself. So I would say the American people are propagandized more than other people, and that's how it's swayed. And it's not just the government that does it; it's the military-industrial complex. The corporations are as big a part of it as the government. So, and it goes right back to World War I.
So, did the war in Iraq ever end, or it has had like a stop for a little bit, and now it's against ISIS? Or in your eyes, it's been going on for 13 years?
Well, you got to give Obama credit for trying to stop it as much as he felt he could. It is still going on. There's still drone strikes. We're still propping up the government. We're still trying to tamp down the Kurdish as much as we can independence movement, because Turkey is a NATO ally, and part of Kurdistan is in Turkey, so you can't, they don't want a Kurdish separatist movement to blossom. So it's a very complex situation, and there's still a lot of drone attacks, which is a book called War Made Easy is really quick to point out how dangerous the drone escalation has been. And we've got mercenaries and special operations people still operating in Iraq today. So we've been there since about 1990, and we haven't ever left. People think we have, but we really haven't. We flew a no-fly zone, and that doesn't fly itself. And we enforced a no-fly zone for the intervening years between the first Gulf War and the second one. We were flying no-fly zones. Well, that's caused 1 million Iraqi kids to die, according to the UN analysis. So we've been there, and it's the reason we're there is oil, and we've been there since the early 90s and still there.
So some of the figures that I've found about the war in Iraq is that about 180,000 bystanders or civilians have been killed and about 5,000 soldiers. Are those numbers correct?
Those are pretty fair numbers. Now, those are numbers that they can document. It's not necessarily numbers that they can estimate, but it's numbers that they can document. So, I would probably go with that as probably the best that you can document, but it's certainly not the, I've read numbers as high as 1 million civilians were killed. And we only think about our 5,000, but we don't ever think about who we're killing, I mean, there's a famous question asked of Madeleine Albright about how she thought the Iraqi embargo, which the UN estimated killed 1 million children, and asked if it was worth it. And she said, yes, it was. She later backtracked that. But her first response when reporters asked her that a few years ago was, yes, it was. Our no-fly zone killed 1 million people, children. Not people, but children, 1 million children. So we're not counting the cancer. Iraq has a very high cancer rate from depleted uranium shards that come off those anti-tank rounds that are fired, and they're highly carcinogenic. We're not counting those. We're not counting deaths like my friend who died at age 49 probably from some stuff he breathed into. There was an ammo dump that got blown in the first Gulf War, and he was downwind of it, and the VA documented he was downwind of it, and lo and behold, he gets pancreatic cancer. Was it caused by that? Hard to say for sure, but it probably was. His number's not counted in there, so these numbers are hard to come by. If you shoot somebody, that's easy, but there's a lot of things that a lot of reasons people get killed in war that's not directly a result of gunfire or bombs.
So what is the estimated number of wounded soldiers from Iraq that you know of?
I'd have to go to Iraq body count to get that. I haven't looked at it in quite some time, so I really don't know. It's in the tens of thousands, but again, depends on how you count it. Should post-traumatic stress people be included in that? I would certainly say so. I lost a good friend about a year ago, hung himself. 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne, and 33 years old, he hung himself. He gets counted in those suicide numbers, but is he a casualty of war? Sure he is. There's a lot of things that goes into those numbers that should go into those numbers that don't. My best friend in the world has got post-traumatic stress from back-to-back deployments in Panama in '89. He was stationed there when we threw out Noriega, and then he went to the 82nd Airborne and got into combat and has post-traumatic stress disorder. Should he be counted as combat wounded? He's certainly documented by the VA to be a casualty in that regard, and he gets money for his compensation packet, but he's not counted as a wounded warrior, so to speak. So it's a hard number to come by. It depends on how you define it.
And this financial number you guys have on your website, is it in the trillions? Like, it was hard to read.
Yeah, I think estimates around $2 trillion is what they estimate that war is going to cost. And there's a lot of things in that. Again, my friend's PTSD settlement goes into that number because it is a cost of war. And we just don't think about that. We don't think about how much it costs to send a soldier over there. It costs a lot of money.
You've heard about wanting to recruit women in active duty or active fighting. Do you think that's going to happen? And my question is, having worked with survivors of military sexual trauma, shouldn't they deal with that first before they start bringing more women?
I'm a graduate of U.S. Army Ranger School, and I think last June had the first two female Rangers graduate, and a lot of people calling me and sending me emails. Say, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I'd say yes, ma'am, to those girls because they're a lot tougher than I am. That's no doubt about it." When you go through Ranger School, you do what's called phases. You have different phases in Ranger School. When I went through, we had 4 phases. Now they have 3. And if you don't graduate from a phase, you can recycle. So it's about a 50% washout rate for men from Ranger School. Women was about double that in the first class. 9 women started the Ranger course, the first ones that were let in. 5 of them didn't make it past the first phase. They let 4 of them recycle, and 2 of those graduated. So, 2 out of 9, and those were tough people. I always told myself if I ever had to recycle, I was not going to go ahead and get my tab. So they recycled and finished Ranger School, which is something that I would have never done. So, those 2 female officers definitely were my hat's off to them. To your other question about sexual trauma, I don't know that how to solve that problem. The military sexual trauma is about double what the civilian rate is. So for all you ladies out there who think you may want to join the military, just remember that you're twice as likely to be a victim of sexual trauma than a civilian. It's just horrible what is going on. And I think the figure, if I remember correctly, for men being sexually assaulted by other men is about twice what it is in the civilian world as well. So, it's a long-running problem, and I don't know how we solve it. I think taking the legal process out of the hands of the commanders for sexual trauma is a way, because a lot of times good, quote-unquote, good soldiers who have sexually traumatized someone are often not punished because of the military process, military code, Uniform Code of Military Justice, which covers all the branches of the military, is more commander-based than jury-based or whatnot, and so the commander can often influence the decision. And I think taking sexual trauma and putting it in a separate court system may be an answer to help us with that.
And do you think that the draft will ever come back? Let's say that Kasich or Trump get elected, and they pick a fight with.
That's a really good question. If it does, the draft ended in 1975, and I was in the class of 1980, high school class of 1980, and I was in the first class that they reinstituted selective service. So still today, all men who are 18 years old must register for selective service. And I was in the first group that did that. There was 5 years where we didn't have a draft or selective service between 75 and 80. And there was apparently a Supreme Court case that went that basically said that you didn't have to give selective service to females because females were denied combat positions in the Army, and you had a better chance of promotion in the Army, well, in the military in general, in combat positions. Now, obviously, that has been taken off the table. Women are in combat roles and serving in special operations, too, Green Berets and Ranger units and Delta Force and SEALs and so forth, or they're eligible to. I don't know how many of them are doing it now, but they may readdress that again. I'm opposed to a draft. I think drafts are another form of slavery, so I philosophically oppose a draft, period. and I think that would be pretty uniform throughout Veterans for Peace, that we would oppose a draft in any form. We're actually opposed to selective service as well, as just step one towards a draft.
Kasich or Trump get elected and they pick a fight with North Korea, with Syria, with Libya, with everybody. Where are you going to get all the troops? Where are you going to get the people to go?
Well, we didn't seem to really have a problem, recruiting people to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I was in the military in the late 80s, the U.S. military was primed to fight 2.5 wars. In other words, we could fight a two-front war, one obviously with the Russians and one with the Chinese, and then provide military support to another theater. So if there was ever a three-front war, we were prepared. That was the doctrine at the time. After Iraq and Afghanistan, they have changed that. They just realized that there is no way to fight a two-front war. Even as big and as strong as many people as we put in. And I think part of that is because of the 1960s and 70s anti-draft movement was so effective that I don't think there will ever be a war again. They'll try everything, a draft again, rather. I just really think that they'll try any method they possibly can, because they know the minute they institute a draft, that their kids will have to go, or their friends' kids will have to go, and not just the poor, and they'll do anything in the world to avoid that. We fight proxy wars all the time, and always have. That's something the British Empire figured out a long time ago. We didn't figure out until recently. So, we hire mercenaries. I could have easily, with my background, could have easily gotten, I'm too old now, but I could have gotten a job with a military contractor. I had a friend of mine who retired a few years ago, 22 years in the military, and they offered him a $250,000 contract to go into the Iraqi Green Zone, a guaranteed contract never to leave the Green Zone, $250,000 a year. They'll hire mercenaries the way the British did. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the French Foreign Legion, but basically the French Foreign Legion will take anybody, and after 5 years of service with the French Foreign Legion, they'll make them a French citizen. Well, guess who gets deployed first? The French Foreign Legion. They'll try that. They basically have with the, if you're in the military, you have an accelerated citizenship program, so they kind of have that already. They just don't separate them into a segregated unit the way the French do. But they'll try getting any kind of method they can short of a draft to not have a draft. I think whatever clever thing they can pick up. We hired the Mountain Yards in Vietnam to fight. They were discriminated minorities, so we had those guys fight for us. The British had the Gurkhas. It just goes on and on. We'll try proxies before we try a draft again, I think.
And do they target people with low income? Do they purposely go to those high schools?
Yeah, they go to those high schools. They target the immigrant community. And I think it's 18 months to become a citizen if you've joined the military, which a lot of those people would have to wait 5 years. So, there's some incentives. And if you've got, if you're a citizen and you've got family in your home country, that puts them at a higher priority to get your family members here. Any little trick that they can do to recruit people, they will.
Thank you so much for your time.
I know I ain't been here for a long time. Doing better on my own now, it's my time. It's what I chose, it's what I own, it's my life. Last time I checked and looked it up, it's all mine. I know I ain't been here for a long time. Doing better on my own now, it's my time. It's what I chose, it's what I own, it's my life. Last time I checked and looked it up, it's all mine. I'm on line, I'm on track, I'm just fine. I may find when I look back, it's all mine. I may find when I think about it, it's all mine. I may find if I look inside, it's all mine. See, the choice is yours to unlock the force, lock 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 the force.